Hey guys, Kevin Clear here with a knife video for you. Today is going to be a comparison video, and the comparison is going to be between two knives that are on my short list of favorites and that I would highly recommend. If you're even kind of considering picking one of these up, absolutely do it. One is the Zero Tolerance 0200. The other is the Spyderco Manix 2 XL. Okay, I think both of these are awesome blades. Both of these are on my short list of favorite knives and on my in my group of knives that will just never leave my collection. Okay, so the reason I'm doing this comparison is because number one, these two are very similar in size. They're very similar in purpose. Even the materials are the same, the handle size, the blade length, all very close, and even the price point on these is fairly close. Now I will say secondary market, yeah, probably still pretty close. I will say these I've seen as low as $85, $90 in the secondary market. I've seen them brand new for as low as $120, and I think they're $129 on like Blade HQ, although they say they're out of stock and maybe won't ever get any more. But right now they're actually not that hard to find, but they are discontinued. Okay, now the Manix 2 XL is a fairly well-loved knife, probably not quite as popular as the Manix, but it is a reasonably popular knife from Spyderco, and I hope they don't discontinue it because this is a real favorite of mine. I really think that this is a win. So a little more readily available, and again, I think you can probably pick these up used for around $100, maybe a little less, and brand new. I got this one brand new, I think on Amazon, but I could be wrong. Don't hold me to that, but I know I paid $116 for it, which I thought was a really good deal. So that's how these compare initially, and I think there'll be a lot of crossover in terms of people looking for a knife that's a little more hard use, that's maybe a little more tactical or combat ready, maybe for firearm backup or as some emergency service or for a soldier, or even just a regular person who likes larger knives. The utility and toughness of both of these is really right up there with some of the best knives you could find. So for all those reasons, I think you would want to consider these two as sort of comparable and worthy of this discussion. Now, let's start off with size and weight, which is pretty much where we always start off. So I'm gonna, for no good reason, start with the Manix 2 XL, and the size on this is 9 inches overall, okay, 9 inches overall, 5 1/8 inch handle, 3 3/8 inch blade, and 5.2 ounces. Now, one thing I will add to this is that it's about 1/2 inch thick, and the only reason I'm telling you that is because, you know, this one is much thicker. So that's where we'll go next. What's interesting about this, and I will make a comment here in a second, but let's just get the stats out of the way. So this knife, unlike the one we just talked about, is a little bit shorter, 8 7/8 inches, okay? 5 1/4 inch handle and 3 3/4 inch blade. Now, that blade length is measured from the highest point on the handle, and you can see how the handle comes up quite a bit. If this little sort of rise here wasn't there, the blade length would be more like 4 inches, okay? So there is this sort of steep angle on the top part of the handle there. So that does affect our numbers just a little bit. Overall, it doesn't, obviously, 8 7/8. Now, the weight on this guy is 7.9 inches. 7.9 inches is, you know, pretty, or I mean 7.9 ounces. Why did I say inches? 7.9 ounces. And this one is quite a bit thicker, okay? It's a full 5/8 of an inch thick, and maybe a little over 5/8 of an inch thick. So that's how these two compare in terms of size and weight. We're going to talk about blade length or the blades on these two in a second anyway, but before we even get there, I should point out that even though this measures 3 3/4 inches, the actual blade length here is over 4 inches, just over, but over, okay? And the opposite is true on this. Even though on paper this has the longer blade, the actual cutting edge is only 3 1/2 inches. All right, so that may be something that you want to consider. Let's go ahead, since we're kind of going there anyway, and talk about the blades on these two knives. All right, as we've been doing, we'll do the Manix first and kind of continue. We'll just continue with that theme as we go through. So the blade on this is basically 3 7/8 inches, full flat ground S30V steel. Now the cutting edge is 3.5 inches, and that's because of the finger choil there that takes out about 1/2 inch of cutting edge on you. So very good. The blade is fairly thinly ground, okay, so fairly thin and fine out here at the tip, okay, but overall it's a fairly strong blade, but you just, because of its full flat grind, it starts thinning right from here and just gets progressively thinner all the way to the point, okay? Now, let's contrast that with, and by the way, I will say, this is a fantastic utility blade. Before we switch here, I've done all kinds of cutting. I've carried this knife and used this knife a lot. Number one, check out how well the DLC's held up. You know, I've had this knife in my collection for a long time, done quite a lot of cutting with it, carried it a lot all over the place, still in great shape. Now, same can be said for the 0200. It is a DLC coating as well, and that coating also holds up really well. Now, it is a thicker blade stock. Okay, it's also though a steeper grind angle, and it's sort of a high flat grind, so it is still a flat grind. I wish it was a hollow grind, but what I will say is if you compare these right at the tip, they're almost the same. However, okay, very quickly the 0200 gets fat. Okay, this angle from the cutting edge up to the flat is much steeper than the angle on here. So if this is the Manix, this is the 0200. I'm exaggerating, of course, to make my point, but this thickens up much more quickly and therefore gives you a stronger blade. Okay, you're going to be less likely to break this blade off, even though the tip is fairly fine, which means you're going to get that really good penetration. You're going to get really good cutting performance out of this knife, and that's one of the things, I've said this over and over again, guys, I love it when a hard use knife still slices well. I drives me crazy when someone thinks, well, since we called this a hard use knife, we should put this, you know, super open angle on it and make it so you can't do anything but split logs with it. Okay, I like my knives to be able to cut, and this one really, really will, even though you've got pretty thick, heavy-duty blade stock, okay? I think a knife like this, you'd look at it and go, oh yeah, that'll slice like crazy, and it will. Now, let's talk about the differences in the edge shape itself. This one has much more belly, okay? And in some ways, for that reason, is possibly more suited for slashing. When you, what can I pick up here? Let's use our little Spider-Man doll. When you go to hit something like this, that belly is going to slice right in very, very quickly and very, very easily, okay? So in this kind of a motion, this knife is going to perform a little better than this one, even though this one's still going to perform really, really well. Okay, now, the other thing we should notice is notice the recurve on this blade. Some people hate recurve blades. I understand. I disagree, but I understand. I actually really like recurves. I find that if you're cutting something, that recurve gives you that ability to really get a lot of material in terms of a lot of blade and a lot of force into the cuts you're making. Okay, it can really, really go digs in, which I think is great. Now, the steels, okay, S30V is going to outperform 154 CM in terms of edge retention and corrosion resistance, but not by much, okay? Probably 80% of knife users, maybe 90% of knife users would not notice a significant difference between these two steels. Yeah, when you sharpen it, there's a slight variation in the two of them, but part of that is because I find S30V is a little difficult to sharpen for what it is, okay? That is, in terms of how hard it is to sharpen compared to how long it keeps an edge. S30V is pretty tough to sharpen, and it holds an edge well, no question, but it doesn't hold it just crazy well compared to, let's say, D2 or S35VN or, you know, other steels we could talk about, but it's fairly tough to sharpen, okay? So yes, it holds an edge well, but it is tough to sharpen. 154 CM holds an edge well. It's not as difficult to sharpen as S30V, but it doesn't hold an edge quite as well either. Okay, so both great steels. Yes, it is true and legitimate to admit that 154 on the sort of quality and cost scale does come a little below S30V. Okay, so if you're a real blade snob, you might prefer the Manix just for that reason alone. Although I would say if that's your only reason, you should probably at least consider trying some other steels. Now, what about lockup and deployment on these two? Oh, by the way, we should be comparing these, okay? Now, let me back up really quickly. So usually I declare a winner in each of these categories, and so let me go back quickly to size. On the size and weight, obviously the Manix, you're getting a lot of knife for a reasonably small weight at 5.2 ounces. You're carrying a heck of a lot of weight at almost 8 ounces with the 0200. Okay, so in terms of just size and weight, carryability, comfort in pocket, and the amount of knife you get for the weight you have to carry, the Manix 2 definitely blows away the 0200. When we get down to blade, okay, the S30V is certainly better, there's no question in terms of just quality, but in terms of aesthetics and in some ways in terms of performance, when we think of strength, cutting power, and looks, I think the blade you got to give to the 0200, although I understand that if you don't like recurves, forget it. That whole conversation goes out the window. I personally really like recurve blades, and so for me, this is totally awesome, okay? I know that some of you just feel strongly about, I hate sharpening recurves, I can't do it, whatever. That's fine. But for me, the blade here, once we sort of get beyond the steel, I prefer the blade on the 0200, although I will readily admit that the S30V is a superior steel. Now, what about lockup and deployment? We have the ball bearing lock on the Manix, okay, and that ball bearing lock is essentially Spyderco's attempt to do something similar to the axis lock. Now, it's quite a bit different, okay? Instead of a U-shaped spring coming down here, it does have a coil spring, and you're compressing that coil spring. A lot of people have talked about the fact that from sort of an engineering standpoint, the coil spring is superior. Certainly, if you feel this in hand, you know that this is a much stiffer lock. Now, maybe you prefer that it's not that stiff compared to a Benchmade, but what about compared to a liner lock? Okay, well, this liner lock is really thick and quite sturdy. So I think strength-wise, these two are going to be very close. Now, I will say in terms of how simple it is to design and engineer this lock compared to this lock, this one's a little more, it's a little easier to get this one right and make it secure. Okay, once the ball bearing goes into the slot on the blade, you're not going to get it out. It's under spring tension pretty well in there good. There is a chance that with a frame lock or a liner lock where you've got this lock bar that pops over under the blade tang, you could, if the geometry is off just a little bit or if there's something interfering with that lock face, you could have a knife that fails a spine whack or an overstrike. Okay. I think you're going to be less likely to fail those tests with this lock versus this lock. Although having said that, when you're actually using both of these knives, okay, they're designed so that, let's see if I can get the fat of my finger in here. Okay, so I've got the lock unlocked. Okay, see, I can move the blade. And let's imagine I'm doing something and somehow the lock fails and I can close the knife on my fingers. Notice what happens. The way this flipper mechanism is designed to wrap around my index finger, it makes it so the blade actually cannot close on me. Now I might get a hard pinch, but I'm not going to cut all my fingers off. All right, the Manix, same thing. Let me undo this lock. Now the Manix is able to close further, but it's still protecting your fingers if you're holding the knife, if it's actually in use when it fails. All right, now really the rule of thumb is don't trust any knife lock, okay? There's always a chance they could fail. There's always a chance that this blade could close on your fingers. So don't do this kind of thing, don't do a kind of cut where, or don't do anything where you're pushing a lot of pressure on the back of the blade and your hands are on here. Don't do that, okay? There's not much reason to anyway, but just in case that ever comes up, just don't do it, okay? Now, in terms of actual ease of deployment and smoothness and how enjoyable they are, the Manix is pretty stiff, and that's the only drawback to it. And other people have talked about that as well. Yes, I can actuate it quite easily with one hand. I can do it with my thumb. Now, I don't know if I can flick this open with my thumb. Oh yeah, I can. There you go. Now, same thing here. I can flick this open. I can use the flipper mechanism and open it. But I will say this. The 0200 is very smooth, okay? The Manix, it's nice, but it's not as smooth as the 0200, okay? The lock, I would say give a slight edge to the ball bearing lock, but in terms of the performance, in terms of how comfortable it is, how smooth the action is, I've got to give that to the 0200. So because of those two things, it's almost like a toss-up between these two on lockup and deployment. And I will say that I'm very impressed. Neither one of these have ball bearings. I'm really impressed with the pivot on the 0200. It just works extremely well, even though there's no ball bearing pivot here, there's nothing else. That smoothness is achieved by nothing more than quality control and precision build, okay? Now, what about the handle? So lockup and deployment, I've really got to call it a toss-up between these two, because although I like this lock a little better, I like this performance in terms of smoothness and flippability a little bit better. All right, so handle on the Manix 2 XL, nice and big. Definitely excellent retention, fairly good good grip. It's the Spyderco G10, so it's not quite as grippy as, say, Cold Steel. The jimping, however, is extremely functional, really locks you in. The proud liners, that is where these bumps kind of come up past the G10 scales, they don't actually do a whole lot in bare hands. Now in gloves, they tend to catch a little bit more, all right? And so we've got, G10 that's fairly grippy G10. We've got proud liners and really good jimping. Ergonomics on this are excellent. Okay, I definitely have no complaints. I never thought this was an uncomfortable knife. But we switch over here to the 0200. You have 3D machined G10 with this very heavy pattern on it. The jimping on the back of the blade is quite good. The very deep finger choil in the front here really naturally fits the curvature of your hand. In some grips, now in a standard saber grip like this, the swell here in the handle is just perfect. Okay, in some grips, maybe a hammer grip or a reverse grip, that swelled out section is a little too big, okay? I still like the swell and I wouldn't get rid of it, but if it was toned down just a little, all right? So, this one feels much nicer in hand, just feels more natural. It just fits the contours of your hand a little better than this one, okay? But in terms of retention, they're the same. In terms of options, the Manix is a little better because it does have the finger choil, and I really like that little choil at the front, and so you get a little more versatility in terms of how you can hold this knife, all right? Probably some of you look at that handle and it kind of reminds me of the Cold Steel Spartan, certainly does that. Both of these do a good job of using the shape of the handle to really grip the hand more so than just making a plain old round or square handle and trying to use texturing. I think I prefer when a knife thinks about how a human hand is going to grip this and designs the handle so that it's going to retain well, okay? And both of these definitely do that. The clip, both of these clips, now this one carries a little high with the standard clip, but I've got this Casey Lynch clip on it, and I'm telling you, if you've got a Spyderco, an Endura, a Delica, a Para 2, a Manix, a Domino, any of the standard 3-hole Spydercos, and you don't have a Casey Lynch clip, you are missing out, man. These things are so awesome, and it's a huge improvement over this knife, okay? This knife normally carries quite high in pocket compared to this one for sure, and really compared to any knife. So the deeper carry is really nice, and essentially it just makes it kind of how it should be. All right, it does interfere with the lanyard hole just a little, but That's how these two, they're both G10, they're both really grippy, they're both really comfortable. This one is a little more, you know, hand fitted in a saber grip. This one is a little more versatile, okay? Now, how do you call a winner on these? The only thing I'm gonna give it to the 0200 for one reason and one reason only, and that is the 3D machining, okay? I really like that 3D machining. It adds an extra process to the construction, so you're getting very, very good value on this knife. And it does, almost any knife that has 3D machine handles is going to be more comfortable than any just slab construction knife. All right, so, excuse me, that's how these two stack up in terms of the handle. Again, I can't really declare a winner on that part. They're just different. This one's a little more versatile. It's a little more comfortable in different grips. This one has the 3D machining, and it does have a very natural, very comfortable grip in a typical saber grip, which is how most of us use our knives most of the time. Now, again, I hope I've given you enough that your preferences will inform which one you like better. Lastly, let's give sort of an overall impression, okay? If I was gonna pick one of the other of these, I don't know how I would do it. I think for me, and this is almost purely aesthetic, I just love the look, the style of the 0200 by Ken Onion. If you prefer the style of Eric Glesser over Ken Onion, then you're gonna prefer the Manix. Now, the practical side of me says, hey, the Manix wins because it's lighter weight, it's just as tough, the lock is exceptional, the blade being full flat ground is very, very versatile, even if it is just a little slighter than the 0200. And so on pure, I think, mechanics and practicality, I think the Manix gets it. Now, when it comes to design, when it comes to style, when it comes to cool factor, and a knife that just looks really bad, I've got to give it to the 0200. So, you know, I guess I've declared like a technical winner and an actual winner. And I really don't know how else to describe these. These are both awesome knives. If you're fortunate like me, you can own both of them and enjoy both of them. And I do, you know, switch these. Sometimes I'll carry one in the morning and one in the afternoon, all right? So both great knives. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope that gives you some things to think about, not just about these knives, but I try to design these videos so that even if you never buy one of these, it's still a fun discussion to have, and it's still a fun thought process to go through. So there you go, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll talk to you later.